Hello, my friends. And I want to focus on what is quickly becoming a pivotal financial and political inflection point in the Russia-Ukraine war. The European Union's decision to approve a so-called 90 billion loan for Ukraine, while backing away, at least for now, from the far more reckless plan to engineer a much larger loan secured against Russian assets frozen in Euroclear. Alongside that, Britain has quietly been forced to drop its own parallel scheme involving frozen Russian state assets held in the UK. These developments matter because they reveal, in plain arithmetic, the West's shrinking capacity to keep Ukraine afloat, and they illuminate why Moscow has no incentive to bend in negotiations. Before I get into the mechanics of the EU decision, note what's being reported. Kirill Dmitriev, head of Russia's direct investment fund, and an advisor to President Vladimir Putin, is reportedly traveling to Miami to meet with key U.S. figures Witkoff and Kushner about the state of peace discussions. I'll come back to that. For now, the immediate story is Europe's financial improvisation and what it accidentally admits. The EU has approved a 90 billion loan to Ukraine, and it did so while failing again, at least for now, to proceed with the separate and more legally explosive idea. A 140 billion loan that would have been secured by frozen Russian assets held at Euroclear. The moment the EU backed away from that Euroclear collateral plan, Britain, whose government we now know had been pushing this approach hard, was also forced to drop its own version. The British plan reportedly involved an £8 billion loan using frozen Russian state assets in Britain as collateral. This is being framed as a blow to Britain, or at least to Prime Minister Starmer, and the officials still feverishly committed to Ukraine's war effort. In a deeper sense, it's actually deliverance. Britain narrowly avoided escalating into an openly lawless financial precedent, something that would poison London's credibility as a global financial center long after this conflict ends. Still, the politics in London are such that the people who want to be seen as the most militant backers of Kyiv will treat this reversal as a defeat. And it gets more revealing. Reports indicate Britain is not currently positioned to provide further direct lending to Ukraine at all. In recent hours, small admissions have surfaced in the London media that corroborate what has been stated repeatedly. British support totals roughly £5 billion per year. That number has been cited many times by Ian Proud, a former British diplomat. It was always credible, and now it's being indirectly confirmed through fragmented disclosures that, when assembled, converge on that same figure. There is also talk reportedly embraced at the highest political level in Britain of providing Ukraine around £2 billion from the proceeds of Roman Abramovich's sale of his stake in Chelsea Football Club. The UK position is that Abramovich was supposed to send that money to Ukraine, that he promised it. I have no special insider knowledge on that claim, and I won't pretend otherwise. But let's state the obvious. Using those proceeds in this way would amount to taking money that is not the British government's to take. It would carry long-term consequences for Russian investors' willingness to place assets in London even after the war ends, and even if sanctions are ever lifted. This is not trivial. London has historically benefited from large inflows of Russian capital, including significant funding to British institutions, universities in particular, where some Oxford and Cambridge colleges have received substantial donations and endowments connected to Russia. But beyond the Abramovich seizure attempt, what else can Britain do? The answer, according to current reporting, is essentially this: offer security guarantees, which in practice means credit guarantees. In other words, Ukraine borrows money, and Britain promises to cover some part of losses if Ukraine defaults. That is not hard cash. That is not direct funding. It is a financial workaround designed to sustain the appearance of commitment while sidestepping the reality that London cannot keep writing checks. And even credit guarantees may not be particularly effective, because global investors have no compelling reason to be enthusiastic about Ukrainian debt at this stage. There are good reasons to be cautious, and those reasons connect directly to the EU's 90 billion move. Now, we need to get clear on what this loan actually is. because the political label and the financial substance don't match. The EU says it will lend 90 billion to Ukraine, but Ukraine is not required to repay it. The repayment, the EU claims, will supposedly come from Russia after the war ends. Through reparations, Russia is assumed to agree to pay Ukraine. That already makes no sense. It is a loan whose repayment depends on a future political fantasy. Russia losing, Russia accepting blame, Russia agreeing to pay, and Russia transferring enough money to cover the EU's financing costs. And here's the reality. Russia owes Ukraine no debt. If anything, the relationship has historically run in the other direction, with Ukraine having owed money to Russia stemming from prior loans and debt arrangements. So the EU is constructing a scheme in which it lends money to Ukraine today on the assumption that Russia must pay an unspecified future reparations bill after losing the war. This is not normal finance. This is a political spell being cast over bond markets. So ask the basic questions. What if Russia wins as it is currently doing? What if Russia refuses reparations? What if the war ends on terms where Russia is not the defeated party? Then who repays this loan? Not Ukraine, by design. Not Russia, because there is no mechanism to compel it. And Russia will not sign on to a reparations narrative that assumes its guilt and its defeat. So does the debt simply sit on the EU's books indefinitely? If the EU plans to float this financing in international markets through bonds, as appears to be the case, then bondholders will eventually demand their capital back, not merely interest. The pressure to redeem principal does not disappear because Brussels uses a comforting word like loan. Bonds mature. Investors expect repayment. If neither Russia nor Ukraine repays principal, then the EU itself must, and if the EU repays from its budget, that burden flows directly to EU member states, meaning taxpayers. 3 governments, notably Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, have maneuvered to carve out exemptions. Everyone else, ultimately, is on the hook. That means that at some future point at an unknown time, the capital behind this 90 billion program will have to be redeemed by European governments. That alone is bad enough. But what makes it worse is the bizarre indefinite loan character implied by the way this is being discussed. Nearly every sovereign bond issue has a defined maturity date. Here, we are being asked to imagine bonds for which the repayment timeline is essentially whenever the political story turns out the way we hope. That is not an investment product. It is a wager on propaganda. Investors who buy such bonds will demand a premium. I've seen discussion of an interest rate around 3%, but I would not be surprised if it is higher, especially as the perceived probability of repayment from Russia or Ukraine declines. The more remote the repayment scenario looks, the higher the yield investors will require to compensate for time risk and political risk. And again, who pays that interest? The EU budget. And who funds the EU budget? Member states. So Germany, France, Italy, and the rest must contribute enough annually to cover the interest on this loan at a time when European economies are already heavily indebted and under strain. And this 90 billion comes on top of other major EU-level debt programs already floated through bonds backed by the EU budget. Recall the massive 750 billion recovery program associated with the post-pandemic period, commonly linked to 2021. Those bonds carry interest costs too, and they also mature over time. The underwriting ultimately rests on member states, again, taxpayers. Back then, there was a widespread assumption that Europe would experience rapid recovery after the pandemic. That recovery did not materialize as hoped, and a major reason is the war and the economic war imposed on Russia, especially through energy disruptions and the cascading costs of fertilizer and feed. A recent British report, cited in the Financial Times, has said openly that it is no longer profitable for English farmers to produce food under current cost pressures. And those pressures, as the FT itself made clear, are connected to the West's economic war with Russia. That matters because it shows the self-inflicted economic damage rippling through Europe while Brussels simultaneously adds new debt burdens to finance a war effort in a non-member state that is losing. Debt levels are already severe. France struggles with debt to GDP above 120%. Italy is higher still. Spain is also high. Germany has been lower historically, but Berlin is accelerating debt accumulation rapidly through ambitious rearmament and infrastructure programs that are not delivering the promised outcomes. Add to this a new debt instrument that may carry a rising interest cost and an undefined principal repayment horizon, and you create predictable political tension within the EU. Domestic budgets are strained, voters are squeezed, and governments will face growing backlash against sending more money to Brussels to fund ever more EU-level liabilities. This is precisely the environment in which the European Commission's long-standing appetite for Eurobonds becomes relevant. Eurobonds have always been linked to mechanisms of deeper fiscal union, direct taxation powers, and centralized debt management. Southern debt states, Italy, Spain, Greece, and to some extent France, have reasons to like that direction. The original Eurobond concept, however, was built on a key assumption. Germany would remain the low-debt anchor capable of carrying the shared credit weight, effectively letting high-debt states borrow on cheaper terms. But what happens if Germany's own fiscal position deteriorates and its industrial economy weakens? What happens as Germany's current account strength erodes? Opposition inside Germany to underwriting EU-level debt could intensify sharply, and it is worth remembering, under current European legal frameworks, Eurobonds are widely treated as illegal or at least prohibited under existing constraints. So by taking this step, the EU is generating future institutional crises, financial, political, and legal. And that's only the beginning, because it is not even clear Ukraine will receive the full 90 billion as cash support. I've been scanning media coverage trying to understand the structure. When the earlier 140 billion Euroclear collateral idea was being discussed, it was relatively clear how it would be split. 100 billion in new money for Ukraine and 40 billion to repay an existing 40 billion loan Ukraine already owes to the EU. But we have not seen clear reporting on whether the 90 billion now approved is entirely new money for Ukraine or whether it includes repayment rollover elements. If the entire 90 billion goes directly to Ukraine, then the EU must be rolling over the prior 40 billion loan still on the books. In that case, total exposure is not 90 billion, it is effectively 130 billion. Yet, that is not how it is being described publicly. Since I have not seen that stated outright, I continue to assume the structure remains similar to what was previously implied. 50 billion for Ukraine and 40 billion to address the earlier loan. If that's true, then Ukraine is getting roughly half of what it wanted. There is some nominal clarity on Ukraine's planned deficit next year, around 43 billion. A 50 billion injection would, on paper, cover it, but everyone understands that the 43 billion figure is political theater. The true deficit is likely significantly larger. I've seen estimates around 60 billion, and that alone would mean 50 billion is insufficient on the day it arrives. And that's under current assumptions. If conditions worsen, as they likely will, Ukraine's financial hole expands further. This is why voices in Kyiv, parliamentary figures, and others are already warning that the money on offer is nowhere near enough. They are saying it will not cover 2 years. Frankly, it is hard to see how it covers even 1 year. A financial crisis in Ukraine next year is not a distant hypothetical. It is baked into the numbers, unless new sources of funding appear. So where would additional funding come from? The U.S. Congress has passed a major defense appropriations bill that allocates $800 million for Ukraine over 2 years, $400 million in 2026, and $400 million in 2027. In the context of tens or hundreds of billions, this is trivial. It might cover a few weeks of spending at most. The fact that Congress authorized any funding is not good, but the fact it authorized so little indicates something more important. Enthusiasm in the United States for funding Ukraine is draining away. Even Democrats who remain openly supportive appear increasingly unwilling to propose large new packages. These sums are rounding errors in the U.S. budget. They are symbolic, not sustaining. Could U.S. funding increase again? Politics can change, and there remains institutional support for Ukraine inside Washington's permanent national security bureaucracy. But for now, it does not look like the U.S. is prepared to step back into billions upon billions mode, especially with domestic political incentives discouraging it, and with future electoral dynamics making Ukraine funding a liability. Then there are the IMF and World Bank. For years, these institutions have supported Ukraine since the 2014 crisis, whether one calls it Maidan, Revolution of Dignity, or coup. They continued support even after Ukraine effectively defaulted in 2015, bending or breaking their own rules. But commentary from the IMF increasingly suggests the institution is approaching the limits of what it can justify internally. Continued massive support is becoming contentious within the IMF's board and risks putting the IMF itself in a compromised position, especially given that it ultimately relies on member state cash injections, including from Western powers, to maintain its own stability. So consider the EU's earlier flirtation with the Euroclear collateral plan. Why would Europe even propose something so legally risky and so visibly corrosive to financial norms? The answer was admitted by its proponents. Europe is reaching its funding limits. Declining growth, rising tax burdens, political fragmentation. These pressures constrain Europe. Britain faces similar constraints. That is precisely why they were trying to crack open the Russian assets as a new funding reservoir. And since that plan has been shelved, we are now watching them improvise with a loan that is not a loan in any normal sense, and that pushes future costs onto EU taxpayers through the budget. This is why when Ukraine hits a deeper financial wall next year, as it will, it looks far less likely that Europe, Britain, or the United States will be able to rescue it again at the same scale. Europe and Britain were already openly saying the limits had been reached, which is why they promoted the Russian asset approach. That reality does not improve with time, it worsens. And even the 90 billion arrangement will create continuing strain, maybe not instantly catastrophic in pure cash terms, but significant in the political economy of Europe's rising debt load. It is also far from certain that Europe can repeat this trick 6 months from now, either politically or in the markets. This brings us to Putin's remarks. At his press conference, he was asked by Russian media about the European retreat from the plan to seize frozen Russian assets. Putin responded with a pointed distinction. Theft suggests something done secretly, whereas what is being proposed is done openly and publicly. Therefore, the correct word is robbery. In his framing, the Euroclear plan would have been the biggest bank robbery in history. And if it returns in summer 2026, it would be an attempted repeat. Those are Putin's words. But note what supports them. A growing body of legal and institutional warning signals. The IMF, the ECB, Euroclear itself, and the Belgian government have all indicated in various ways that the legal risks are real and severe. Other European governments also appear uneasy. Governments can change, of course. Belgian leadership could change, Italy's leadership could change, but even there, it is not obvious that changes would produce more compliance. In some countries, changes could yield governments more skeptical of funding Ukraine at all. So, what happens if Europe faces the same situation again in summer 2026, but with worse economic conditions and weaker political cohesion? Isn't it more likely that if they backed off once from the Russian asset heist, they back off again, especially from a weaker position? If so, what is left? One commentator has observed that the EU loves false binaries. European leadership framed the choice as between the catastrophe, a loan secured against seized Russian assets, and the mere disaster, the €90 billion loan backed by the EU budget. The obvious third option, stop funding Ukraine, was not seriously offered. Europe chose the disaster over the catastrophe. But if the same crisis returns with higher debt stress, higher interest costs, and even less public tolerance, the third option becomes more likely, whether Brussels admits it or not. Remember, before the Brussels meeting, the talk was already widespread that Europe was reaching the limits of what it could finance. If there was truth to that in December 2025, it will be even more true in mid-2026. When Ukraine's next funding crisis hits around the time Europe's own economic pressures intensify, the ability or willingness of the EU to bail it out may have melted away. You can argue that the United States, with far greater capacity, hit its limit earlier, which is why after the change of administrations, U.S. funding fell sharply. European states individually began hitting their limits through 2025, Germany being the notable exception, funding Ukraine roughly at the level of around €1 billion a month, while other states reduced support significantly from midsummer onward. If that trend continues, and the math strongly suggests it will, then EU-level support could also begin to unravel by midsummer 2026. If so, Ukraine will find itself in the worst position it has faced: liabilities it cannot cover and external funding streams drying up. In a rational world, funding for Ukraine would have been scaled down long ago. Instead, politics has overridden arithmetic since 2014. But even politics eventually collides with fiscal limits. Now, return to negotiations and the reported Miami meeting. Dmitriev may be meeting Witkoff and Kushner, and there is speculation that U.S. President Donald Trump is heading to Florida and might seek an in-person meeting with Dmitriev. It's important to understand Dmitriev's role. He is not a full-time government official with plenipotentiary authority to negotiate on Russia's behalf. He can relay views, clarify what is unacceptable, and perhaps point Americans toward reality. But the final decisions are Putin's, along with Russia's Security Council, and Russia has been crystal clear. Proposals coming out of Europe and Kiev are unacceptable. Russia wants Ukrainian withdrawal from Donbass and also from Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. Stories about Russia agreeing to ceasefires in those regions have not been confirmed publicly by Russian officials. Claims that such reports had a factual basis have repeatedly lacked corroboration from Russian government sources. What we see now is that those earlier claims were untrue. Putin has reiterated that the objectives announced at the start of the special military operation must be fulfilled. The conditions he laid out in his speech at the Russian Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024 remain in place. There has been talk from Russian officials about concessions or flexibility in past discussions, particularly linked to a meeting in Anchorage. But when Russia publicly describes its current stance, those alleged concessions are hard to identify as actual substantive retreats. Trump has reportedly grumbled that as Russia advances, its position hardens. Perhaps Trump believed Russia had offered more flexibility earlier than it is demonstrating now. In time, we may learn what was truly discussed. For now, the observable reality is straightforward. Russia is sticking with what some analysts call Istanbul Plus, not necessarily Russia's own label, but a useful shorthand, and it is showing no sign of walking back from its core demands. So what does Dmitriev tell American interlocutors? The best he can do is state plainly: the European and Ukrainian proposals will not fly. If American envoys think they can carry those ideas to Moscow, they will find doors closing. They should not waste the trip. Why would Russia budge? Moscow can do the same math the West can, and frankly, Russia is very good at math. Russia sees the West approaching financial limits. Russia is aware of procurement constraints and the West's declining ability to supply Ukraine with weapons and materiel. Russia also sees the Ukrainian army's attrition problem, losses it cannot replace, desertions rising, mobilization failing. Ukrainian intelligence chief Kyrilo Budanov has made bitter statements indicating the mobilization plan over the last 2 years has been a disastrous failure. Those are extraordinarily strong admissions. Russia also tracks Western strategic documents. It sees statements from the U.S. establishment indicating that stabilizing relations with Russia is considered a core American interest. And Putin has stated openly, responding to an American journalist, that his conscience is clear. He claims Russia did not start the conflict. He blames Western powers and Ukraine. Many in the West will reject that and accuse him of lying. But the point is what Putin believes and projects. He sees Russia as holding a winning hand, morally and materially, and therefore sees no reason to concede. That brings us back to the battlefield. Over the last 24 hours, there has been intense discussion of Russian strikes on bridges around Odessa, and the speculation that Russia may be preparing an amphibious operation to land infantry in southern Odessa region. The bridges have been damaged, reportedly not fully destroyed, but transport can no longer cross. Speculation is that Russia is preparing a bridgehead. I remain skeptical about a major amphibious landing in winter conditions. It is not that the Black Sea Fleet lacks capability. Ukraine has still managed to send drones, including underwater drones, across the Black Sea. One penetrated the harbor at Novorossiysk, another attacked targeted tankers. Ukraine has also launched drone attacks against tankers far from the immediate theater off West Africa and more recently off Libya. Putin reacted sharply to this, arguing it will not stop Russian oil exports but will raise insurance premiums for ship owners, and he indicated Russia would respond sharply without specifying how. One possible sharp response could be intensified action against Odessa, perhaps to close the port. After the attack on a Turkish merchant ship in Odessa, the port is reportedly nearly closed already. Ukraine still has weapons it could use against ships, missiles, possibly remaining Storm Shadow stockpiles, but winter sea conditions create operational challenges even in the Black Sea. Similar speculation appeared weeks ago about a river crossing operation around Kherson and alleged bridgeheads. No strong confirming evidence ever emerged. A Black Sea landing near Odessa in winter would be even more demanding. That said, Russia's general staff does not brief me, and it does not broadcast its plans. We do know Russian planning includes Odessa and Mykolaiv. General Gerasimov was seen with a map showing those areas under Russian control. The strategic intent is not subtle. Putin's symbolic actions meeting senior military figures in St. Petersburg, visiting historic sites tied to Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, signal a worldview in which these territories are historically and strategically central. Those plans exist. The question is timing. My expectation is not within weeks, but later, late spring, perhaps May. Still, what is happening now around Odessa is significant. There are reports of prolonged blackouts, even semi-permanent ones. Civilian protests have occurred. The shadow of the Russian army is falling over Odessa, and Kiev cannot ignore that. Putin also provided an overview of the front lines in his press conference. I won't reproduce every detail as a separate list. The essential point is the same. Russia is advancing, Ukraine is shrinking. Putin spoke of Kupiansk under Russian control, and of Russian forces squeezing Ukrainian troops trapped on the east bank of the Oskol River. He spoke of control over substantial portions of Lyman and Kostiantynivka, expecting Lyman to fall under Russian control soon. He also suggested more Russian victories would be announced before the new year. Mapping projects show signals that align with this. In areas like Mirnograd, zones previously depicted as contested have shifted into gray status entirely, often a precursor to collapse of organized resistance. If Mirnograd falls imminently, the broader Pokrovsk-Mirnograd configuration could pass fully under Russian control, which would further undermine Ukraine's ability to hold nearby positions like Kostiantynivka for long. If Russia truly controls more than half of Kostiantynivka as claimed, then sustained Ukrainian resistance there becomes increasingly hard to imagine through winter and into early next year. The broader mood is unmistakable. Putin projects confidence. Russia projects confidence. From his perspective, everything is converging. Battlefield momentum, Ukrainian mobilization failure, Western weapons constraints, and Western financial exhaustion. Russia senses victory approaching. The exact shape of victory is still uncertain. Victory can generate new problems, but Putin clearly believes Russia holds the winning hand already. And alongside the military picture, Russia's economic posture is being used as reinforcement. Central Bank Chair Elvira Nabiullina has clarified inflation figures. The claim is that inflation will be around 5% or FEM, 6% roughly in that band for all of 2025, while December's year-on-year price growth is running around 4% near the central bank's target. Manufacturing growth continues. The harvest is described as strong. Reserves are said to be back at or above pre-2022 levels and even growing, perhaps unsurprising if Russia continues to run a current account surplus. Putin cited a debt-to-GDP ratio around 7%, contrasting sharply with France, Italy, Britain, and Germany's deteriorating trajectories. The point being pressed is clear. Russia is not collapsing. Russia is positioned to outlast. So when American envoys and European politicians talk about negotiations, they need to face the basic logic. A side that believes it is winning militarily and can endure economically has little reason to make concessions. Russia sees the West's position weakening financially, politically, and materially. If Europe's funding is turning into indefinite taxpayer-backed debt instruments and Britain is reduced to credit guarantees and asset seizures, what exactly is supposed to intimidate Moscow into compromise? From Russia's vantage point, it is the West that is improvising and retreating, not Russia. That is why the EU's decision matters. It is not merely a technical loan. It is a signal flare. It says, we cannot keep doing this the old way. We are running out of politically acceptable money. And when even the new way is structured on fantasies, Russia paying reparations to repay European bondholders, the exhaustion becomes visible to anyone willing to do basic arithmetic. In that context, the reported Miami discussions whether Trump meets Dmitriev or not may amount to little. Dmitriev can listen, convey messages, and warn Americans away from European daydreams, but Russia's demands are set at the top, and Russia believes time is on its side. That is the reality sitting underneath all the noise. Europe's debt, Britain's constraints, America's dwindling appetite, Ukraine's fiscal cliff, Ukraine's manpower crisis, and Russia's growing confidence that the board is tilting its way. The EU meeting in Brussels increasingly looks like a tipping point, not because it saved Ukraine, but because it exposed how strained, improvised, and legally precarious the Western funding machine has become. And when that machine sputters again in mid-2026, as the math suggests, Ukraine will confront a convergence of crises, financial, military, and political. At that point, plans and packages may no longer be enough. Arithmetic, at last, will have its day.